Vietnam War Buildup 1964 to 1969. The United States' involvement in Vietnam began to escalate in the early 1960s, and after 1964, United States was fighting a full-scale war. Beginning in 1965, the resulting increases in military expenditure raised government purchases, usually during a period when government purchases are rising rapidly. Central banks raise real interest rates to keep the economy from overheating. The first tax act of the Vietnam era was a tax reduction. The Revenue Act of 1964, which was implemented to counter a perceived economic slowdown. This act embodied many of the proposals made by President of America in 1961 to get America moving again. Its major provisions included a reduction in individual income and corporate tax rates, and an expansion of the standard deduction. The Vietnam War period, however, is unusual because the Federal Reserve decided to keep real interest rates constant. This period provides an excellent example of how policymakers could make use of the IS curve analysis to inform policy. The rise in government purchases would shift the IS curve to the right from IS 1964 to IS 1969, since the Federal decided to keep real interest rates constant at 2%, with equilibrium output rose from $3 trillion in 1964 to 3.8 trillion by 1969. But all was not well for the economy, since the increase in government purchases with the real interest rate constant led to an overheating of the economy that eventually resulted in high inflation, which will be discussed in the coming chapters. Changes in taxes. In 1968, a 10% surtax was imposed to pay for the Vietnam War, which raised revenue by about 1% of GDP. Now let us look at figure 4 to see what happens if the government raises taxes from $3 trillion to $4 trillion. IS-1 represents the same IS curve that we developed in figure 1. We determine the equation for IS-2 by inputting the $4 trillion value in the equation presented. At a real interest rate of 3%, an equilibrium output of 10.5 minus 3 to come up with $7.5 trillion, which we mark as point E in figure 4. At this real interest rate, equilibrium output has decreased from point A to point E, as shown by the leftward arrow. Similarly, at a real interest of 1%, an equilibrium output has decreased to 10.5 minus 1 to come up with $9.5 trillion, causing a leftward shift from point B to point F. The IS curve shifts to the left from IS-1 to IS-2 because of the increase in taxes. We then have the following result. At any given real interest rate, a rise in taxes causes aggregate demand and hence equilibrium output to fall, thereby shifting the IS curve to the left. Conversely, a cut in taxes at any given real interest rate increases disposable income and causes aggregate demand and equilibrium output to rise, shifting the IS curve to the right. Policymakers use both tax and government purchases policies to stimulate the economy when it enters recessions.